So if you haven't been on YouTube yet today and you haven't seen your inboxes just slapped with a bunch of new videos about the Intel 10th Gen drop, well, here's another one to add to it. Today we're going to be talking about the 10th Gen. Can you call it a generation? It's not new architecture, it's new speeds and some new little nuances on the same 14 nanometer technology. But regardless, let's talk about that. I checked the mail, and I guess Intel forgot to send me my chips in the mail, because I checked and all I got was that stupid Joe Biden ad that says, Joe Biden for the Chinese, because I throw that out every single day, and then I come back and it shows up again. Who's putting those in there? So being the actual small tiny channel I am, I don't have any of the chips to actually test out and, benchmark against other CPUs that AMD offers in the same range. But what I do have is the benchmarks and statistics that other big channels have benchmarked and put them through. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So one big thing that Intel did integrate in this new 10th generation is that hyper-threading will be featured in even the i3 chips. And this is to compete with AMD, as pretty much all their chips have hyper-threading ability. So although it's not a new generation, as all we're seeing is pretty much new speeds and more cores and threads. You can add as many pluses on there as you want to the 14 nanometer plus. It's still on the 14 nanometer process. So there's not a lot of innovation in that sense, unlike AMD, who is now on the 7 nanometer. So Intel did integrate some pretty opportunistic features like the thermal velocity boost. So here's pretty much what thermal velocity boost is in a nutshell. It's an AI-powered frequency boost that opportunistically finds chances to increase speeds in the certain conditions. It has to be under 70 degrees Celsius, and it can only be achieved on a single core. All-core max boost on the i9-10900K is 4.8 gigahertz. Another cool feature is Intel Boost 3.0. So Turbo Boost 3.0 essentially has the chip determine which two cores are performing the best, and then it allows short bursts of improved turbo performance to those cores. So if it's not obvious yet, Intel is trying to squeeze out every bit of clock speed they can on this aging architecture of 14 nanometers. But the real question is, how does it perform in gaming? And of course, how does it compare to the Ryzen 9 3900X? Let's find out. So one of the first benchmarks we're going to be looking at is the Cinebench R20. Here we're going to the 3900X against the 10900K in a multi-thread and single-thread application. In the multi-thread, not surprising here, the 3900X blows it out of the water, almost 1,500 points better. In the single thread, a lot less of a gain. You can see that the 10900K edges it out by about 20 points. Next up, we're gonna be looking at Adobe Premiere Media Encoder, 10-minute 1080p file. On this is time in seconds, so a lower time is better. 3900X comes in at 331, the 10900K at 611. So about double as fast as the Intel 10th Gen 10900K. Next up, we got Blender BMW 27. This is the same thing. This is a time in seconds, so the lower score is better than the higher score. The 3900X did it in 118, while the 10900K did it in 144. A little bit closer of a gap, so it's not surprising at all that the AMD chip outperforms the Intel chip when it comes to processing power for video editing, Photoshop, and just everyday workloads. Next up, we got Firestrike Ultra. The 3900X overall scored 8,565 and 8,311 in graphics, while the 10900K scored 8,753 overall and 8,481 in graphics. A little bit of a lead for Intel on this one, but still, the margins are pretty close. On to the Time Spy benchmark. The 3900X overall scored a 14,146, and in the graphics scored 14,649, while the 10900K scored a 14,463 overall and a 14,772 in graphics. So on to the games. This was benchmarked in 1080p and in 2K 1440p as well. The 3900X in Ashes of the Singularity averaged a 92 FPS in 1080p, 91 in 1440p, while the 10900K averaged 103 in 1080p and 100 in 1440p, edging it out by about 10 FPS. And I also think nobody's really surprised by this, as the last gen, the i9-9900K, also outperformed in gaming. On to Far Cry 5. The 3900X averaged 127 in 1080p and 122 in 1440p, while the 10900K averaged 163 in 1080p and 138 in 1440p. So in 1080p, you see about a 40 FPS difference, which is a big difference, but let's be honest. In 1080p, are you buying a $500 CPU, or you're going to be gaming in 2K or 4K, something like that? So although the 1080p performance is quite a bit, the 1440p is a lot smaller. It's about 15 FPS
and that's going to be the the main target for the chip. If you're using a $500 CPU, you can be doing a 1080p. That's for sure. There probably is people out there who are doing that, but 1080p is where the big difference is. 2K is definitely a little bit smaller for margin. On to Borderlands 3. The 3900X in 1080p averaged 179, 1440p 123, and for the 10900K 187 in 1080p and 126 in 2K. A 3 FPS difference in 2K and an 8 FPS difference in 1080p. So very close on Borderlands 3. So Kyle's testing pretty much confirmed what we already knew. The Intel chips are still the king of gaming. What he found was about a 15% difference in 1080p and a 10% difference in 2K. But for multi-threaded tasks, the Ryzen 3900X performed about 35% better, and encoding time was better at 45%. So for multi-threaded applications like video editing, rendering, and stuff like that, the Ryzen chip blows it out of the water. Yet in gaming, it is better, but is it worth it? I don't know, because that's such a small gain. It's such a small gain. But let's move on, see what other people have to say. So Jay did a little bit different. He actually took the top 10th gen chip, which is the 10900K, and compared that to the last generation in i9-9900K. And what he found out was that in the 3D Mark Time Spy CPU test, the 10900K with the turbo boost settings turned on scored about 13,591 compared to the 9900K without that technology. That scored a 10,279. So a 3,200 point difference, which is pretty impressive. And we have another BMW 27 benchmark. The 10900K with the Intel Turbo settings scored a 140. You want lower in this. And the 9900K scored 158 points. So an 18 point difference in the Blender benchmark BMW 27. The next benchmark was the Cinebench R20. The 10900K in multi-thread scored 6,181 points, and in single thread it scored 514 points. And the 9900K in multi-thread scored 4,971, so about 1,200 difference. And in a single thread application, it scored 495, so only like a 20 point difference. The single thread score is pretty much on par with the new 10th gen, but it really gets blown out of the water when we're talking about multi-thread with that 1,200 point difference. That's quite a big gap. On to our good friend Linus. Now he tested a bunch more chips, but I'm really going to be focusing on the top two chips, the 10900K and the Ryzen 3900X. And in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p highest settings, the 10900K had an average of 160 FPS, while the Ryzen 9 3900X had an FPS average of 137. So we're starting to see a little pattern here, right? Not like we're surprised, but we're seeing a pattern. The Intel chips, the 10900K is performing better when it comes to gaming applications, and in productivity applications, that's where we see the 3900X really shine. So in Doom Eternal at 1080p Ultra Nightmare preset, that's pretty scary sounding, the 10900K averaged about 268 FPS, while the Ryzen 9 3900X averaged 266. So for this game particularly, they are pretty much exactly on par with each other. For Red Dead Redemption 2, the 10900K averaged about 109 FPS compared to the 3900X at 99 FPS. A 10 FPS difference in this game, still pretty close. 10 FPS is really not that big of a jump when you're in that high of an FPS range. So now we're back to Cinebench R20, where we see the 10900K in single core score 532, and in multi-threaded, we see it score 6,204 against 529 single thread score for the Ryzen 9 3900X, but the multi-threaded score at 7,253. So going back to single core performance, Intel that's where they shine. But multi-threaded performance is where the AMD chips really outdo Intel. It really shows with 1,000 points more than the 10900K and Cinebench R20. Another Blender test, and this time BMW and Classroom. This is in time and seconds, so the lower number is better. In BMW, the time was 2 minutes and 28 seconds, and the Classroom was 8 minutes and 1 second. Where the Ryzen 9 3900X was 2 minutes for the BMW and 5 minutes and 51 seconds for the Classroom. So about 30 seconds better in BMW and 2 minutes and 10 seconds better in Classroom. Another pattern we're seeing here when it comes to rendering, the Ryzen 9 3900X definitely beats out the Intel chip by a landslide. And then of course we have Steve from Gamer Nexus, who is, in my opinion, the best to do it. So the nice thing that Steve does in these tests is that he tests them at the boost clock and he tests them at stock speed. So we're on to some more FPS testing and some more games, and I'm pretty sure I know what we're going to find out, but let's check it out. The 10900K at stock speeds in F1 2019 at 1080p high settings had an average FPS of about 275.5, while the Ryzen 9 3900 at stock scored about 237 FPS, which that's a pretty big margin if you ask me. On to the next one, we're going to be looking at Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p high settings, and the 10900K at stock averaged 178 FPS, while the Ryzen 9 3900X at stock averaged 147.2 FPS, about 30 FPS difference. So yes, Intel is still king when it comes to gaming. So what's the ultimate verdict here? Is it too little too late for Intel, or is this the next big thing that everybody should be going to? Well, in my personal opinion, the 10900K is going to retail at about $500 on release, while you can get the Ryzen 9 3900X at the moment for $400. So $100 price difference. So with the 3900X granting us 12 cores and 24 threads, and the 10900K giving us 10 cores and 20 threads, the ultimate verdict is, I think it depends on what you plan to be doing. If you're strictly gaming, the 10900K could be worth the extra $100 if you want that 20 to 30 FPS difference, but overall, the 3900X is just a much more efficient and better chip. Overall, gaming included, processing power included, and productivity application. Now, if you're a content creator, a streamer, something like that, then I still think the 3900X is the better option. Let me know what you guys think down below of the new 10th gen Intel drop. I'm, not really that impressed since we're still on that old architecture. I really want to see some innovation out of Intel. When this video is done, I'm going to call my guy at Intel and I'm going to let him know my chips never arrived. I don't know if they got lost in the mail, with this whole coronavirus. Shipping's a little wonky, but, it never showed up. And I really thought with my 450 subscribers that they would send me one, but I guess I was wrong. So that's it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think of the new Intel 10th gen processors down below, and we'll see you in the next one.